And I tell young people and entrepreneurs, you need a big brother or big sister. Don't think you have to do it all on your own. Find somebody who's been through it, who can help guide you. Maybe you're giving them some stock. It doesn't matter. I mean, if they have some compensation, great, they're incentivized. But the most important thing is find somebody who can help you, who can hold your hand, help you on how to pitch, help open doors of introductions, help do some validation for you. We couldn't have done it without Stelios. My second company, Renovis, that Mark Tessier-Levine and Tito Serafini and I did, we couldn't have done without Ed Penhote. He was our big brother. And my way of repaying and sort of the payback for Stelios and Ed was the way I try to help young people these days. It's a fun role to play, to be big brother. And of course, women being big sister in the same sort of role, trying to help mentor entrepreneurs on how to raise money, who to talk to, what sort of people to get on their board, how to build their company, and how not to make certain mistakes. You learn from your mistakes. It's fun to talk about the successes, but the best learnings are often from the mistakes and trying to educate people on how to do it right.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
I have a very special guest today, Corey Goodman, the managing partner of VenBio, a venture capital firm he co-founded in 2011. If you don't already know about Corey, you will know why he's so special by the end of our conversation. VenBio already has 7 FDA-approved drugs on the market, saving and improving lives. Corey spent 25 years as a professor of biology at Stanford University and Evan Rauch, chair of neurobiology at UC Berkeley, where he was a HHMI investigator, head of the Neurobiology division, and co-founder and director of the Wells Neuroscience Institute. Corey co-founded 7 biotechnology companies and led one of them, Renovis, as president and CEO from a private to public company until its acquisition by Evotec. 2 of the companies he co-founded have been acquired and 3 have done IPOs to date. He then moved to Pfizer, where he was president of the Biotherapeutics and Bioinnovation Center and a member of the executive leadership team. For the purpose of this podcast, we restricted our conversation to the lessons learned from his life as an entrepreneur, the startup ecosystem in general, and now as an investor supporting founders. I got introduced to Corey about 10 years ago by a mutual friend, Doug Crawford, who was previously on the show, and I feel very lucky to present him on the podcast and confident that biotech founders will find this very useful. Corey, it's so good to have you on the show. For me, you're like an encyclopedia for life science startups. You put on multiple hats in your professional life, all of them very successfully. You've been a glorious scientist, impactful educator, a very successful entrepreneur, and one of the best investors that I know of. So I thought the best way to have this conversation would be to divide it into different chapters and try to extract some of the lessons learned. Does it sound good to you?
Sounds good. I think what you're telling me is that I'm old. I hope you're also telling me I have some wisdom.
I'm here to extract all the wisdom. Thank you so much for being here.
Sounds good. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
All right, let's go back to first time I met you. I think Doug Crawford introduced me to you in 2014 when I was hosting a life sciences entrepreneurship symposium. And we were standing in this lunch line and we started talking. The conversation was about the chemistry department at UC Berkeley and how you hoped and wished a lot more comes out of Berkeley chemistry department and you're disappointed. Frame the thing for you. What was going on at that point and where do you see Berkeley now?
Wow. In the 10 years since you and I first met, things have really come a long way at Berkeley. I have to admit, 10, 15 years ago, I was a little disappointed in the Berkeley campus from an entrepreneurship perspective. And to frame this, remember that first I got my Ph.D. at Berkeley between 1972 and 1977. And then I came back. I originally was a faculty member at Stanford, got tenure there very quickly. Berkeley brought me back to help build neuroscience. I came back in 1987. And so I was a professor. I left to go be CEO of a company I started. I left in 2001. And Berkeley has fabulous science. It's, I think, the best public university and certainly one of the very best research universities in the world. I'm a huge Berkeley fan. That's why I came back to Berkeley from Stanford. But 10 years ago and a bit longer ago, I was disappointed in Berkeley. I was watching what Reg Kelly and Doug and others were doing, mostly centered around UCSF. QB3, yes, involved Berkeley, but I found that Berkeley's attitude was sort of, give me the money, but we're just going to do our research. I didn't see that entrepreneurial spirit on the campus I loved. And I mean, I think I was a bit critical of chemistry. I was a bit critical of MCB, my old department. If I go back even some years before, I'm going to blow your mind. I'll tell you, when I announced in 2001 that I was taking a leave of absence to go be CEO of a company that I had co-founded, I had some Berkeley faculty in MCB come and say to me, shame on you, you're setting a bad example for the students. What they didn't realize was that their graduate students were so afraid to talk to them about alternative careers other than simply becoming a professor and replicating the career choice their advisor had made, that their students used to come and talk to me because students came to realize I was open-minded. There are lots of ways to contribute to society. There are lots of ways to make an impact. And if we truly want to impact human health, then we ought to be thinking about how to turn science into medicine and how to help human health in so many ways. So I found it very narrow, very myopic. This university I loved, I thought kind of had blinders on. So what's happened since 2014? It is simply remarkable. Individuals make a difference. I would say Carol Christ being chancellor. She's about to step down in just in another week. I am an enormous Carol Christ fan. It started back when she was vice chancellor back in the late 90s. Carla Schatz and I could never have started the Neuroscience Institute if it wasn't for her. I mean, she helped navigate the university. She understood what we could do to make connections between the social sciences, the biological sciences, the physical sciences. So I knew already Carol was a big thinker. But what I watched in her as chancellor, in part, was that she embraced this entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, look, just for starters, I mean, she's been working with Barbara Baker and others, the starting of the Baker Lab incubator, the old museum, but also appointing Rich Lyons, who's about to be the new chancellor in just a week and a few days. I mean, that was inspired. To me, Carol had inspiration, and now handing the baton off to Rich is purely inspired. And it's what this university needs, because it is saying that we really do intend to be not only a place to think and to learn and to discover, but a place to get those discoveries out for the good of society, not just in the people we produce, but in the things, the ideas, to turn our students and our postdocs into entrepreneurs. I mean, that's wonderful. And I've seen in the last few years, it's almost an explosion. So if you look back to 2014, when you and I met, my comments to you were spot on then. And if you were to run into me at that lunch line today and say, Corey, what do you think? I'd say, Berkeley is the most with it campus, perhaps in the country or in the world. It has been a remarkable 10 years of seeing this myopic campus just open its eyes to the impact it can have on society and really foster entrepreneurship. Hats off to Carol, hats off to Rich. Look at what David Schaefer has done in helping to build the incubator, taking the baton from Reg. I mean, to me, Berkeley is no longer a follower. Berkeley is a leader, and I'm really proud to be part of it.
Absolutely. It is a fascinating story. I was laughing when you mentioned about QB3 and UCSF leading that entrepreneurship, because I used to come from Berkeley to UCSF for workshops that Doug was running in the middle of the day. And my PI pulled me aside and he's like, where are you going in the middle of the day every week? And that is when I came back and started a postdoc entrepreneurship group on campus. And that's still running from 2010 on. And you mentioned Rich Lyons. He was on my show. The last guest was Rich Lyons. He was
wonderful.
He was also attributing the success to Paul Lalvisatos. I think he was another tremendous leader who helped.
I agree with you. Hats off. I should have acknowledged Paul. Yes, he was a fabulous vice chancellor. And of course, now he's the head of University of Chicago.
Yeah.
He really helped on the inside to foster that whole spirit. I mean, Carol, Paul, then bringing on Rich. I just find that was inspired leadership. Leadership makes a difference on a campus. Back in the 90s, there was inspired leadership with Changlin Tian and Carol, and it was wonderful to see Carol come back as chancellor and to see, I mean, the imprint she will have had on this campus is enormous. I mean, we're going to see that imprint for years to come, and the way she has empowered people in interdisciplinary programs, in ways of trying to take students from what would otherwise be underrepresented groups and help them just prosper and do well, and the way she's tried to encourage entrepreneurship. And it really shows you that individuals make a difference.
Absolutely. That leadership really, really, really makes a difference.
Leadership really matters. That's right.
Yeah. So let's move along. Before we go into this discussion, I want to mention that I'd like to focus a majority of my conversation on bridging the translational gap between academic research and bringing medicines to market, because that is one of your biggest expertise. So let's see if you can come up with some concrete actions for folks for this day and age. Okay. So let's start with your founding your first startup, Xlexus. You founded this when you were a faculty. What do you think would have happened if you didn't start the company and published a paper?
Yeah, that was really interesting times. That was the early 1990s. And people listening have to remember this was before we had sequences of genomes, whether it was the human genome or other animal genomes. And we were doing research. Jerry Rubin and I had adjoining labs up on the 5th floor of LSA. And at the time, my own lab was using Drosophila genetics to try to understand brain wiring, to try to understand not only what were the signals and receptors, but what was the molecular logic of how nerve cells find other nerve cells, find their targets, make the right connections. It was a wonderful time. I have to say, at Berkeley, I had amazing graduate students, postdocs, undergraduates who worked in the labs. It was just a really fun time. Now, before I get to biotech, students today would have a hard time imagining the arguments I used to hear in those days. I mean, we used to hear, well, Corey, that's interesting, but you're working on some evolutionary dead end that has no relevance to humans, and what you learn won't be relative to humans. Before we had the sequences of genomes and realized that we were all made of the same stuff and just how similar were our genomes, there were arguments, especially in neuroscience, having people think things were very different. Those arguments made no sense to me. In fact, if you look up my academic record, I wrote some interesting reviews on the likeness of being, because as we started to discover things in Drosophila, we could very quickly jump to mouse and jump to human. And at the time, I was collaborating a lot with Mark Tessier-Levine, who was over at UCSF, and he was discovering things in mammals. We were discovering things in flies. We were going back and forth, jumping to humans. It was all very fast and very fun. So now to Xlexus. At the time, Jerry and I, and with our colleague who was at Yale, Spiros Artavanis-Sakonis, were realizing that you could learn important things from genetic organisms. Fruit flies, of course, but also nematodes, yeast, ultimately fish and mice, and that you could learn things about disease pathways that would give you important insights for being able to find the right targets and make drugs in humans. And it's interesting to look back. The example we used to use was RAS. Now, you know, just literally now between Amgen and Mirati, and now others coming along, are starting to get the first small molecules against certain mutant forms of KRAS. Incredible for human health and important in leading the way. Back in the 1990s, pharma companies had spent hundreds and hundreds of millions, billions of dollars on trying to target KRAS and could never get small molecules against it. And yet what came out of the Drosophila genetics, out of Jerry's lab, the lab adjoining to mine from Jerry Rubin, we learned there was the whole KRAS pathway. elephants upon the back of elephants. You had kinases affecting kinases. There were these whole pathways of signal transduction, and you could find elements just downstream from KRAS that were much better targets for drug discovery that were in the KRAS pathway and would be just as effective as targets. And that was the principle upon which Exelixis was started. Whether it was the Notch pathway, things we were doing, the KRAS pathway, the notion was that with genetics and epistasis analysis, you could find the best target and the best place to intervene, and that these were going to be universal biological truths. And it was both fun and inspiring to go and to try to raise money. Jerry and Spiros and I, we were the three amigos, as people used to talk, and we quickly hooked up with another friend that Spiros introduced us to, who was also Greek ethnically, Stelios Papadopoulos, who had been an academic at NYU and had then gone into the banking world. And so we used to tease each other, and it's probably not politically correct to tease about ethnicities, but hey, so Jerry and I are Jewish, Spiros and Stelios are Greek, and we're all good friends to this day, and we constantly teased each other. And by the way, they insisted that the company was going to have a Greek name. And we said, okay. But these Greek names were long and impossible to pronounce. And I always used to say to them, we can only pick a Greek name that Jerry can pronounce after a glass of wine. And the Jewish boy from Boston couldn't pronounce many of those Greek words. And I even teased them and said, we're going to call this thing Meshuggah Pharmaceuticals if you guys don't come up with a good Greek name. And they finally came up with Exelixis, or as the Greeks would pronounce it, Exelixis. Exelixis means evolution in Greek. It was perfect for the company that had the principle that from all the model system genetics, you could find the appropriate targets for making drugs for humans. And of course, what exploded right around the same time, as you know, and what all of the students now coming along take for granted is we now know the sequence of the human genome. We know the fruit fly, the mouse, all these organisms, and we know that all of God's creatures are made out of it's evolution. And we evolved from similar pathways, similar genes. What made Exelixis and what we were declaring in that day a little bit more revolutionary was we were saying human disease can be solved. In part, you need to take into account what's being learned from these genetic model organisms. Now you take that for granted. In 1993 and 1994, we used to argue how many genes would be similar. Of course, now we know it's a vast majority. It's fun to look back. Now, I've had students come along and say, well, can you teach us how to form a company like Exelixis? And my answer is, I would never waste your time with that. What we did in 1993 and 94, that was context dependent. That was what we knew and how to raise money in those days. Now, if you want to form something, a company, because of all of what we know, if you came to me and said, well, how do I form a company today? And students ask me this all the time. In fact, I even do some teaching on the Berkeley campus, and this is what it often comes to, is students saying, well, I've been studying, let's say mouse, or whatever organism. I've been studying this in mouse. How do I know, is this going to work in a human? And you know the questions I ask them. I hope you would ask those same questions. A mouse is fine. What do we know about the human biology? First, what do we know from human genetics? Tell me there's some human genetics supporting this, and I'm going to get really excited. Have we done anything with human cells? Have you done any studies in non-human primates? In other words, now we are so focused on the translation of how to go from a mouse to a human. What's going to work? How do we predict what's going to work in a human? But I ask these students today questions we could never dream of asking in 1993 and 1994, decades ago, about human genetics, human cells, human tissue, non-human primate experiments, taking human tissue back into mouse models, syngeneic models. It's a sophistication of thinking we never had and we only dreamed of. That's why this is such a golden era. I used to say back in those days, when it was Jerry and Spiros and I wandering around the venture world, that we were just three scientists wandering in the desert. We used almost the biblical analogy. And I try to encourage students not to just wander in the desert these days. They can be much smarter than we were and focus their thinking much better.
I think it'll be helpful to set that context. Like, how much money were you trying to raise? How hard was fundraising? And what happened around fundraising? Tell me that story.
It's a fun story. I have to think, how much were we trying to raise? I suspect in those days, we were probably trying to raise $10 or $20 million in a syndicate. I don't remember exactly. It was certainly less than people try to raise these days. And we were just wandering around. We would get meetings. All the VCs would meet with us because we were three famous scientists and they were happy to hear what we had to talk about. And people would come back to us. I remember one very prominent venture capitalist was trying to combine us with a failed company of his. People were trying to do all sorts of crazy things with us. The key for us in raising money, the absolute key, was meeting Stelios. Stelios became our big brother, and he's been a wonderful friend and mentor to me ever since. But Stelios was the one who, what he did is he listened to us talk, and he listened to us nerdy scientists give a talk. And I remember he looked at me and he said, Corey, what you guys are trying to tell me is that fruit flies are just little people with wings. Well, you got to figure out how to tell the investors that. And he helped us remake the story, introduced us, helped us raise money. And what I learned from that, and I tell young people and entrepreneurs, you need a big brother or big sister. Don't think you have to do it all on your own. Find somebody who's been through it, who can help guide you. Maybe you're giving them some stock. It doesn't matter. I mean, if they have some compensation, great, they're incentivized. But the most important thing is find somebody who can help you, who can hold your hand, help you on how to pitch, help open doors of introductions, help do some validation for you. We couldn't have done it without Stelios. My second company, Renovis, that Mark Tessier-Levine and Tito Serafini and I did, we couldn't have done without Ed Penhote. He was our big brother. And my way of repaying and sort of the payback for Stelios and Ed was the way I try to help young people these days. It's a fun role to play, to be big brother. And of course, women being big sister in the same sort of role, trying to help mentor entrepreneurs on how to raise money, who to talk to, what sort of people to get on their board, how to build their company, and how not to make certain mistakes. You learn from your mistakes. It's fun to talk about the successes, but the best learnings are often from the mistakes and trying to educate people on how to do it right.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a very important point. I think everybody needs a champion. Every successful man and woman that I know of had somebody championing their cause. Yes. They would be there. You just don't do it by yourself. And the sooner we realize this and look for those champions, I think you'll do better in the world.
Absolutely. And I look back at my own life and career. I had the opportunity. The Society for Neuroscience kept trying to get me to write an autobiography as a famous neuroscientist. And I kept saying, no, I'm too busy. Then during the pandemic, before we had the vaccine, I spent some months just living full-time on my ranch where I am today. And I actually wrote that autobiography. And it was fun to go back and reflect on my life and career and realize how much certain people made a difference. I have to be careful. I can get choked up sometimes thinking about them. I mean, mentors play a really important role. And I remember I tried to emphasize those people from my own life. And I tried to end by saying that I hope for the students and postdocs, and now for other people I'm mentoring, I hope I can just have some of the influence on their life that mentors had on mine. And I just want to mention my first mentor that way. His name is Don Kennedy. He passed away from COVID. He was in one of those sort of nursing assisted living facilities. He had Alzheimer's. Remember when COVID first swept through, and it swept through a bunch of nursing and assisted care facilities. Very sad. I lost him. He was my undergraduate advisor at Stanford, but he became the major advisor of my whole life and career and a very close friend. Anyone listening who knows Don Kennedy knows what an impact he had on people, and anyone who knows me knows what an impact he had on me. An example he set for me. Remember I told you in 2001, I made the switch from academia to biotech. Don Kennedy had many chapters to his life. And we talked about that even when I was much younger, and he was giving me advice. Now, my chapters aren't his chapters. He was a very famous scientist, teacher, professor. He also played a major role with the National Academy of Sciences. He went on to become head of the Food and Drug Administration. He came back to be president of Stanford. He went on to be the editor of Science magazine. Just in those few words, an amazing career. But what he taught me was that as a scientist, you can do many things with your life to have an impact on society as a scientist. And his advice to me was basically, Corey, go knock it out of the park. He even said to me once, think about what's the science. Focus when you're young on what's the science you're going to do to be a famous scientist teacher. Go get elected to the National Academy of Sciences, which I did in my early 40s. After that, the world is your oyster. And as I made changes, he would always congratulate me and just say, follow your nose. See how you can use your science. In my early chapter, it was basic research. I think it had profound implications for our understanding of how the brain gets put together. It has disease implications, but then more focused later on turning science into medicine, on the different ways of training people. I never dreamed when I was an academic professor that I would say to you later in my career that in the last 13 years, we now have 6 drugs approved by the FDA for 8 indications. I'm as proud of that and as proud of some of those clinical trials as I am of what are now the textbook discoveries we made in my lab. Those are all wonderful chapters of life. To me, they're all part of the legacy of what contribution can you make to society. And I really feel it was Don Kennedy, who gave me that inspiration to think that I could do more than one thing and I could lead different chapters of life. And I didn't have to spend my entire life as a professor. And I really thank him for that.
I'm so glad you had a mentor like that. Imagine your life without Don Kennedy.
I'll start to get choked up. Let's not go there. He had a very major influence on my life.
And congratulations on all those achievements. 6 drugs for 8 indications. It's a big deal. I was going through some of your history and I was scared to talk to you today. I want to close that loop on
I'm
something you mentioned.
Please don't be. Let's
something you mentioned about this. These are people with little wings. What was that story translation to the investors? How did you improve on that?
Well, it was interesting. We figured out how to go and tell the industry, tell investors, and tell people at meetings what it was we were trying to achieve, that flies were little people with wings. And actually, sort of a secret is in the early Exelixis days, before we got George Gangos to be the CEO, I used to go off and give a lot of those talks. Now, I say it's a little secret because I was both a Berkeley professor and a Hughes professor. My lab was doing fabulous. I was doing so many things, and I probably wasn't supposed to be giving those talks, but I can probably now fess up decades later. And Stelios took me aside one day, and it was really cute. He said, Corey, of all the academics and, of you and Jerry and Spiros, Stelios looked at me, and if he ever listens to this, he's going to smile because he knows it's true. He said, you're the first one I know who's going to leave academia and go into the private sector because you're a storyteller. You love this. You understand how to connect and how to tell the story and how to build teams. Stelios and I just bonded, and he correctly predicted, I think this was like 1995, 96. I didn't know it then. Look, he knew something about me that I didn't know. In 95 and 96, I was so enjoying, look, we were discovering SLIT and Robo and semaphorins and plexins. Whew! An amazing group of people in my lab and incredible discoveries. But he predicted what came true in 2001, right as I was turning 50. And I thought, if I am ever going to have another chapter to life, as Don Kennedy and I have been talking about for decades, if I'm going to do that, now is the time. And people were trying to convince me that I should think about, they were thinking I was being primed to be the president or the chancellor of a university or head of a research institute. And I was starting to get sounded out for jobs like that. I was being more attracted to the entrepreneurial world. I mean, now being the head of a university as Rich Lyons is coming in looks a lot more fun. But back in those days, I just had that entrepreneurial spirit. And I thought, if I'm going to make a switch, now is the time. And so I went off to be CEO of Renovis. Ed Penhote was encouraging me on that as well. And no looking back, it was a blast. I think it's worthwhile to test yourself at multiple times of your career, not to just take for granted what you know. Taking risk is important. That's part of the entrepreneurial spirit. And it's that you challenge yourself. Can I think differently? Can I do differently? I took risk at the age of 50. At the age of 59, 60 is when well, first of all, in my later 50s, I went inside Pfizer on the executive team. That was challenging myself. And at the age of 60, I started my venture capital firm. I love it. If you ask, I turned 73 in another week. And if you ask me what's going to be my next risk or challenge, I don't know. I'm not there yet. I'm having too much fun helping to start companies.
But I will try and keep following you to see what that next chapter is going to look like.
I don't know what it's going to be, but I think just good energy and asking yourself, how can I take everything I know and I've learned to make a difference for mentoring people and to make a difference for society? And right now, I'm enjoying turning science into medicine and building.
Excellent. Yeah. You mentioned something about industry and how they were spending millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in targeting RAS and stuff. Maybe you can frame this as how enterprising was pharma back in the day in discovering academic work that had potential to be medicines and actually acting on it. And where are we today?
Let me even come more recently. I was on the executive team. I was number 5 at Pfizer between 2007 and 2009 for that 2-year period. And I got to, of course, know Pfizer very well, very intimately, met some great people, learned a huge amount. But I got to see both what Pfizer was doing and what other pharma companies were doing. And you remember there used to be the myth. It came out of, I think, Tufts University. They would do these studies to say that big pharma on average spends about $1 billion for every new chemical entity, or $1.5 billion. So my mind was blown. I'm sitting there in Pfizer at my first executive team meeting. I'm in New York on 42nd Street. I'm in my first executive team meeting. We had a big notebook of stuff, and we're going through some things. And in the middle of that, 4-hour meeting, there's suddenly a piece of paper where one of the consulting groups, I don't remember, it doesn't matter. It might have been a BCG or I can't remember who it was. Name's not important. But they were taking a deep dive into all the pharmas to look at how much they were spending. And so what Pfizer had gotten back was the dot that was Pfizer on that list of how much money per new chemical entity. You didn't get the identity of the other companies, but you got to see the dot and the spread. And with rare exception, they were all clustered. And we moved on to the next page. And I remember saying, it's my sort of style. My first day at the meeting, I said, hold it. Jeff, can we go back? I said, this is blowing my mind. This graph right here, this is saying that Pfizer is spending $8 billion for every new chemical entity.
Wow.
I said, the world thinks it's like 1 or 1.5. And it's not just that Pfizer is $8 billion, the way the others, I don't know which is J&J and Sanofi and BMS, but they're all clustered between like 6 and 10 or 6 and 12. I mean, to me, this was extinction. And what I came to realize in those days at Pfizer was that pharma companies are great for things that require size and scale, for large phase 3 clinical trials, for registrational studies, for international trials, for manufacturing, for sales and marketing. Pharma companies are fabulous at that. But for early discovery, heading into the early clinical trials, they are unbelievably inefficient, to the point that if they relied on their own research and discovery, they would go extinct. And in fact, that's what fuels the biotech world, because they should probably cut, as many of them have, back greatly on what they do, because the way they should get innovation and the way they get most of their innovation is through acquisition. It's business development. And in fact, there was this wonderful guy who came out of Lilly that I met as I came out of Pfizer, Bernard Munoz, and we became good friends. He's written some great papers and people can go look at his work. And as he and I used to talk about, he did strategy at Lilly, that if you take the dollars for every new chemical entity of one of these companies, and now you put in there the dollars that they spend on M&A, it's even larger still. It's astronomical. But what pharma should be doing, everything keeps going off patents. They need new drugs. They need new patented drugs. That's the way their world works. Where they get those drugs from, by and large, is from biotech, is from buying smaller companies. That's an innovation ecosystem. It starts with academia and research institutes. It starts with discoveries there, with entrepreneurs, with starting small companies, all those incubators, all those startups. You go to the more mature biotechs, usually it's with clinical data. Typically, it's going to be with phase 2 randomized clinical data, sometimes in oncology, perhaps phase 1B. But the handoff of the baton from biotech to pharma is going to typically be with some proof of concept clinical data that then they take it to the next level. And sure enough, sometimes those biotechs break through. Occasionally, you're going to get a Celgene, although they then got acquired, or you'll get a Genentech, they got acquired, or you'll get a Gilead that still is standalone. Even Seattle Genetics just got acquired recently. But let's face it, most biotechs, even if they try to grow independently, are getting acquired by the big pharmas. And those big pharmas, their internal R&D organizations are remarkably inefficient. Don't believe what they tell you. They reorganize themselves every 18 months. You and I could spend hours talking about it. I assure you the facts support what I'm saying, that most of the drugs, and I'll give you a good example, are coming from academia, biotech. They're coming from that innovation ecosystem. And that's why that innovation ecosystem works in good financial times, bad financial times, because pharma needs drugs. I mean, look at the world of immuno-oncology, for example. Mm-hmm. When I was head of neuroscience at Berkeley, on the 5th floor of LSA, has a different name today, I'll use the old name, down on the floor below me was Jim Allison, the head of immunology. I remember Jim, I think the year is 1996, published his famous paper in Science, effectively the paper for which he won the Nobel Prize, which he fully deserved, for really discovering the whole notion of checkpoint inhibitors and opening up immuno-oncology. And pharma companies thought Jim was crazy. I mean, he got poo-pooed. Berkeley almost didn't file the patent. I had to help him convince them to file the patent. That's how much people thought Jim was nuts with that. And yet that led to what is ipilimumab that BMS has, CTLA-4, the antibody against CTLA-4. That came originally from Jim. The PD-1 antibodies that became Keytruda and Nivo, those came from different academics and from smaller companies. Acquisitions ultimately from Schering-Plough and then to Merck, or acquisitions by BMS. I think that came from Medarex. Each one has its own history. What we now know of as immuno-oncology, which is saving the lives of people suffering from cancer, that whole field where the drugs are being sold and made by big pharma companies, all of those drugs came from the entrepreneurial world. Each one has its own circuitous evolution of how it got in the hands of Merck, how it got in the hands of BMS. Now, it took Merck, and it ultimately took first Peter Kim and then Roger Perlmutter to figure out what to do with Keytruda, have the muscle, the money, and have the smarts. I mean, Roger's brilliant, and to be able to do all those clinical trials that the small company never could have done, that's the ecosystem. It takes all of us. We can't do it without pharma, but pharma can't do it without the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem of academics, entrepreneurs, and biotechs. And I think that's why our whole ecosystem is going to continue to thrive and go forward. None of us can do it alone. We need each other, and they're natural handoffs. The entrepreneur needs the venture capital world to help build their companies, and then we need the pharma world to really take these things for these big registrational studies and registration and sales and marketing. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be exceptions and that biotech isn't going to sell things. But hey, even look recently, I mean, Mirati got their drug approved. That was my old CMO from Pfizer, Chuck Baum, my good friend. Beautiful job Chuck did of taking that company forward, starts to market it. Now they're part of a big pharma. That's the natural evolution in our field.
You bring up a good point about the role that pharma and big biotech could be very good at. They're not so good at innovation. Let's put it under this startup ecosystem and how we can train our next generation entrepreneurs. Do you have any thoughts about like how a founder should think about that startup journey? Like most probably they cannot just come up with a discovery and then take it all the way to the market and sell a drug. It's a ginormous task. What is a better way to frame this problem for these people? Because I think acquisition at the right point is the best thing to do for these people. How can we prepare these people?
And the answer is yes. They have to think realistically about the evolution of themselves, their company, and if they're so lucky as to make something that's working, their drug candidate becoming a drug. Maybe their company will be standalone, but they have to imagine, just the investors who invest in them are going to be imagining, what's the value inflection point? What's the point where this is likely to be acquired? What are we investing our money? There's each point when investors come in, and you want to understand how that investment ecosystem works, because you want to understand how to pitch what you want to do so that it meshes with what the investment world is looking for. Same thing to think about your own evolution. There are many entrepreneurs who it's their baby. They want to be the CEO. There are some. Look, I've got a first-time CEO of one of my companies. I helped her co-found. It's a woman in Boston. I don't see any limit yet. She's amazing. I'm just loving to mentor her and watching the way she's scaling. I see no limit in her ability. There are many others who are fabulous scientists, but there becomes a point where the baton has to be handed off, or maybe we have to bring in someone who's perhaps has more experience, better at taking the company public, better at setting up and thinking about the clinical trials. That doesn't mean casting the original entrepreneur aside. It says maybe they take on a technology and science role and actually sit with that other person and learn. Life is a learning experience. You don't know everything. And so I try to tell entrepreneurs, in fact, sometimes I say to entrepreneurs when they're starting things, I say, imagine there might come a point where you hand the baton off to someone else. Will you emotionally be prepared for that? Will you work with me with that? Maybe you'll go all the way, but we have to think what's best for the company, what's best for the drug candidate, or if you believe in this like you say you do, you have to work with me to think about what's the path and what's the handoff going to be at different stages. By the way, I don't want to hand things off too early. I sometimes see companies get sold with a lot of important assets that are preclinical. Pharma is going to botch that stuff up. I mean, I would much rather get the money and go get some clinical data. If pharma buys your company or buys your asset when you already have some clinical data, especially phase 2 data, the odds are they're going to do a good job with it. They're much less likely to really screw it up or to just put it on the shelf. So I try to work with entrepreneurs to just have them think about the whole ecosystem and to think about how you're going to build this, how we're going to raise money, when it might get acquired, maybe, when you might hand the baton off to someone else, maybe, just to think about that everything has its natural evolution. And a common mistake they make is from the beginning to worry too much about dilution. And I try to teach them the lesson that it's better to own a smaller part of something that is much more valuable than it is to own a bigger part of something that
nothing.
And to think about not just what your percent ownership is, but what the potential is for the piece of the pie. And I try to instill upon them, don't worry about dilution, but ask yourself, if you're taking dilution and raising more money, ask yourself, what's the value you're building? What is this going to do for your company, your idea, the drug candidate? So it's trying to work with people and help shape the way they think about starting a company.
So there's so many incubators and accelerators coming up for bios now. Like, if there are lessons we can impart at this stage so that they can think right, maybe when they come to you to ask for money and say like, hey, I think these are the 3 or 4 companies that I think can acquire me because it has a good path. Is that something that the investors want to hear? Because people come in like, oh, I'm going to make a difference in the world. I'm going to sell so many drugs, multi-billion-dollar things. They do this customer research. Something is amiss there.
You want to be thinking about some of the later steps. Sometimes people will come to me and say, well, this could be cheaper and as good or a little better than an existing drug. And it's a case where I'll say to them, but let's think for a moment about the clinical trial. How are you going to do and afford the clinical trial compared to the standard of care? Sometimes you need to get academics and entrepreneurs to think about where things are going, how they're going to unfold in the reality of clinical trials, and how they're going to unfold in the reality of the pharma world. So it's good to think about that. There's also the unknown. Today, I might be able to predict tomorrow which pharma company will be most interested in a certain drug, I'm not sure I can predict 5 years from now, and certainly not 10 years from now, because they keep changing. So it's good to look at today, but you also have to realize there's a lot that's unknown by the future. But what you do know is that if you really are first and best in class, if you have something that will truly make a difference in the lives of patients, someone will be there to buy it. If you can really scale it up and make it for enough patients, and if you can make it efficiently, there will be a buyer. Now, sometimes people come along with ideas that you wonder how they're going to scale. I try to avoid, my pet word is avoid what I call elitist medicine. Medicine for something. This often happens in cell therapies where the cells are so hard to make, where you can hardly think of how are you going to produce those cells for more than a few patients, and how are you going to scale it up to make it for a lot of patients. But then technology comes along that allows you to do it. Actually, Dave Schaefer at Berkeley, I'm helping him with a company that he started called Accent, which is just for that area. And that's what intrigued me, because to me, it could take elitist medicine and turn it into medicine for the masses. Take areas for cell-based therapies in the nervous system or even other tissues like type 1 diabetes, and to take cells that are hard to grow to give to enough patients and to come up with a very easy, scalable method that will let you grow a lot of cells. So sometimes discoveries are for the therapeutics themselves. Sometimes discoveries are for how to make things easier, more affordable, more scalable for other therapies. So discoveries come from all different departments, from all different scientific walks of life. But it is good to look forward and ask, how's this going to make a difference? How am I going to move this forward?
Your statement about medicine for the masses, it reminds me of something I read on your mission statement. You said, we seek out teams who are developing treatments that will have a meaningful impact on patient care. What does that meaningful mean?
Yeah, it means that you can really reach people and reach people in normal hospitals, that it's not just going to be a therapy that maybe you have to have access to the top person at UCSF or Stanford. It would be nice if people going to hospitals even think of the Bay Area and Sonoma and Napa and down in Monterey, if those people can get the therapies too, truly therapies for the masses. What was the beauty of what Jim Allison did, of what became for CTLA4 and for PD-1? The beauty of those things is that all you have to have is a transfusion center. And now hospitals all over the world have transfusion centers. It's something that you could just put in a bag and transfuse. You didn't need some procedure that only Stanford and UCSF could do. To me, that's what I mean by medicine for the masses. You'd like to have an impact on healthcare in a broad sense and not just be what I would call elitist medicine. And we do keep that in mind when we build companies and when we help to finance things. I want to think the outcome at the end is an approved drug, an approved therapy that is going to make a difference for a wide group of people.
Thank you for elaborating on that. I want to go back to big pharma and biotech companies. M&A comes at a later point, but during the early phases of startup development, a lot of times they have to partner with big pharma and big biotech companies. Maybe you can start with your first experiences, initial experiences, trying to partner with these companies. What are the lessons learned, and where are we today in terms of those transactions?
The answer, of course, is we've gotten a lot more sophisticated. We on the biotech side and pharma as well for what works. Yeah, in the early days, I learned through watching Exelixis and working with it and watching George Gangos, who was our CEO, with different partnerships with pharma companies and just watching what works, what doesn't work. You can't just throw things over the transom. It has to be a true partnership that involves people. The people have to be able to work with each other on both sides. And just watching over the years, I think now we have a much better idea of how to do pharma partnerships. And my advice to entrepreneurs is it can sometimes be really good for a company to have a partnership. You can learn a lot. You can watch what pharma is doing. You can go to school on them as they're going to school on you. But there also can be the mistake of doing too many partnerships. Get your small company involved in too many partnerships. Now, what drives that? The thing I told you to be careful of a little while ago, worrying about dilution. You say, look, I can raise all this money in a non-dilutive way through all these partnerships. And gee, I'm going to keep a bigger ownership. But suddenly you're going to find out that all of your employees, instead of working on the value creation of your own projects, are all working to satisfy those pharma companies and those partnerships. That too can be a mistake. I mean, it's finding the middle ground, how to learn how to have a partnership. And look, if you have a partnership with a big pharma, the venture world loves it. It's a validation for you. There's no question. It helps to build value. But I would just say, don't partner everything. Keep things for yourself and make sure you have the resources and the people to drive and execute whatever is the major drug candidate or candidates of what you're trying to do. Make sure those partnerships don't become such a distraction that they keep you from achieving your main goal.
Good points. Good points. Any mistakes that you have committed over the years?
Oh, how many hours do you have? I remember, I think Dave, I'd have to go look up my notes over for the Baker Labs. Dave and Reg had me give a talk one time in which it was really fun. They invited me and they asked me to not talk about the good things, but to give lessons from all the mistakes I've seen that I've made and I've watched people around me make in my career. And I forget, I think I came up with 30 or 40, and I could have gone talking for hours. It was actually fun to look through a career, just the career in biotech, and think about the mistakes. Think
What
about
would I have done differently is the topic of that.
Yeah, I mean, it is really a lot of fun. And in fact, I encourage both you and I encourage people, if they're talking to people who have experience, to not just let them go on about the good times, but to talk about the mistakes, talk about the things that could have been done differently. It's really a fun topic. There are so many places in the raising of money, the hiring of people, the trusting your own gut in certain sorts of decisions. By the time you get to my age, certainly my math skills aren't better than they were in my 20s. My math skills have probably gone a bit downstream. What you get from all those years, and you get from the chapters and all the experiences, is you get the wisdom of that perspective. I mean, I always remember from Stelios and then from Ed Penhote as he helped us start Renovis. What I learned from Ed was he just had so much wisdom because he had gone through so many experiences, and you could take to him a certain problem. I'll give you an interesting example. When I was CEO of Renovis, I had a board that was mostly investors, and that's what's going to happen to most entrepreneurs. Their board is going to become dominated by investors. My board had two kinds of investors on it, all nice people, but they had two kinds of experiences in their past. There were those investors who had just come out of the consulting world. They had worked for McKinsey or BCG or maybe become bankers or analysts, and then they became VCs. And then there were those investors who had actually been CEOs, had major C-suite roles in companies, and then become investors. I found that when I really needed advice, you know which group I went to for advice. It was a group that had themselves been operators, had been management, people who have been through managing, who have had to deal with hiring, firing, HR issues, how to deal with setbacks, how to deal with good times. Those people were the ones who were the most valuable for me because they had actually experienced it firsthand. And no knock on my other investor board members, but I'm just thinking back, it was Ed Penhote, John Walker, Yasunori Kaneko. Those were my three board members who had themselves been CEOs in major management positions in biotech and in pharma. And boy, I learned a lot from them when I was CEO. And that's the sort of role I try to play now when I'm trying to mentor younger entrepreneurs.
Yeah. You mentioned a bunch of things that you could have gone wrong with. Let's go back to your teams, both in academia and biotech, and even now today in your venture firm. Looks like you've been phenomenally successful at each of these stages. Were you doing anything intentional about building those teams? What worked and what then in terms of lessons others could learn?
You try to just learn over your years how to pick people. And it's just getting an instinct, not just for what somebody has done, but do you think they're going to be a team player? And how nimble are they going to be in being willing to change their ideas? Biotech is a team sport. One of the big changes of going from academia to biotech, in academia, your lab you may think of as the team, but you have to worry about everybody's credit, their first authorships, their last authorships. I mean, go back and look at my resume and you'll see how many papers I put myself not as the last author, but the second to last. So I could make a graduate student first author, a postdoc last author. You're worrying about the credit people get because that's how those careers are based. When you get into biotech, it's a team sport, and you need to get athletes who are going to think of it as a team sport in the way they're going to interact with others and the way they're going to accept ideas and how nimble they're going to be to change those ideas. And you're trying to get an instinct for that. And you're also trying to get a sense you want to bring in some experience. It's good to have that youthful exuberance also teamed up with people who have been there before and have experience. You're trying to get it right. And I think I'm getting better at it, but I'm not going to name names on mistakes, but I've still made mistakes. I've made mistakes in the last number of years on hires in the C-suite where I wish I could go back and redo some of those. But I think your batting average gets better as you understand how to interview, how to talk to people, how to try to learn what sort of team player they're going to be. And
maybe you can elaborate on that subject, right? Like, how do you pick, maybe interviewing, if you're looking for how is this person going to be in the future, nimble or team player, what kind of questions do you ask for?
It's hard. You're asking them through experiences and you're trying to let them tell you about things they've done and trying to ask them about how they would deal with certain situations. It's harder than you think because it's often very hard with their references. We live in such a litigious world. It's refreshing when people will honestly tell you what they think is somebody's real strengths, what are their weaknesses, what are things you could help them with, what are things to watch out for. Too often from not, when someone has wound up not being very good, you go back and say, well, that must have happened before. No one ever told me. And then when you poke around, you find out it did happen before and they just never told you. You know what happens when I have to let someone go from a company? They immediately, not everybody, but they'll often, if they're a C-suite, they'll go and get a lawyer and negotiate with you releases where basically there's certain things you can't tell people in the future. This is a real detriment for the field because we let people make the same mistakes over. I have someone right now, I won't tell you company or person, who's out looking for a job. I know where he needs help. I know the kind of position that would be the right position in mentoring for him, but I can't really talk to people because he basically completely silenced me in the way he negotiated with the company counsel. That's a detriment. And so you have to learn how to tease things out, and it becomes very instinctive. But it's hard for me to say exactly what I do, but you just learn over time. You want to disarm people. You want people to feel relaxed. I told you, and you know that my primary residence is on a ranch. And it's a very active ranch in terms of, we have cattle and sheep and horses and chickens. I have had a number of times I've been interviewing people where I find it wonderful to bring them out here. It's a very relaxed environment. You can take a walk, but nothing like telling them, I don't want them dressed up in a coat and tie or a fancy dress, whether it's a man or a woman. I just say, wear your dirty shoes, come in jeans and t-shirt, because we walk around the barns and I sometimes find in that environment, it's a much more disarming environment than interviewing somebody in an office where it's a formal setting across a desk. I have learned a lot about people just by talking to them about their life and learning about them when they're not on guard so much. Nothing like petting one of the horses or feeding a sheep or going into the chicken coop. It's a way to learn about people. I prefer that much more to the coat and tie or fancy dress and people getting all dressed up and all prepared or even prepared for a Zoom interview. Let's find a way to do it in a natural setting where we can really talk about who you are, what this opportunity is.
I like that. Okay, let's shift the gears slightly and talk about your transition to pharma. Why did you end up in pharma? You had the successful biotech founder world going on, and you made this transition. That's 2007?
2007, yeah. The CEO of Pfizer at the time, Jeff Kindler, seduced me. He knew the words to use with me. I never thought I would go in pharma. And so he didn't approach me and say, well, come to Pfizer and be on the executive team. You weren't going to convince me just by saying, I'll give you a bunch of stock and power and all this stuff. That doesn't do it for me. What he said is, look how inefficient Pfizer is. Look at the difference Genentech has made for Rauch. Come teach us how to do the same. Corey, come change the world. He seduced me by those words, come change the world. And I suddenly started thinking, okay, I never thought about doing this. But what if you could take the way I think and the principles of how I think and take them to a large pharma? Now, the reason I only stayed 2 years is because I realized, at least for that pharma at that moment, under his leadership, I wasn't going to be able to do it. Even though he had the right principles to say, come help me change it, in the end, the amount of politics and how he led and just the bureaucracy and the games that got set up made it very hard to set up an innovation ecosystem in that company. And I came to really wonder, how much is it possible? By the time I left, I was pretty convinced that it's so much easier to do in small companies, that it's very hard to change the large ones, that was an amazing learning experience for me. Maybe if I'd been just complete head of R&D, maybe I could have been more impactful. I thought about this a lot because when I left, I got offered behind the scenes for about the next 2 years. I got offered a bunch of head of R&D and very high-level positions in a bunch of other pharma companies. I actually went and interviewed for 1 or 2 just to see if they were really different or the same. And I just came to realize at that point in my life, I wasn't going to do that again. I didn't want to repeat that experiment. And again, even if people meant well, I just wasn't convinced that that was going to be the best use of my time. I saw that I had another good chapter, and the thought was, I'm going back to the smaller company. And I told all the recruiters, the Russell Reynolds, and I know all these people, and I told them, stop asking me. Let's stop this. I'm not going back into big pharma. So let's stop asking me the question if I'll be head of R&D at this place or that place. Stop with the line, come change the world, Corey. I'm going back where I think I really can change the world and have a bigger impact. But I'm taking back to that world the knowledge of what I've learned. Not just the people I've met, but the experience. There were a lot of good things. Look, in pharma, I got to learn about those late-stage trials. I got to learn about registration, about manufacturing, about the commercial sales force. Ian Reed became the next CEO of Pfizer after Jeff Kindler. Ian was on the executive team with me. I had a number of dinners with Ian, and I enjoyed hearing about his thinking, talking to the CFO. I mean, just as you and I were talking, that it's important to get into the head of the rest of the parts of that ecosystem, to understand the venture world, to understand the pharma world. I came to just much better understand the pharmaceutical world, how it worked, what they were having to say to their analysts and to their investors. That was an amazing 2-year education that will be with me for the rest of my life. So no regrets, a wonderful education, but I came to realize the best place for me is right where I am. It's right in the center of the innovation ecosystem. That's what led me a year after I left Pfizer to start VenBio.
Let's talk about VenBio. But before we move on to VenBio, I have one thing. You were growing as a leader all along. Talk about that evolution. Like, what did you realize as you grew in that leadership roles? What did you lack? And what kind of people were you surrounding yourself by? Ed Penrod, he's great. I got to meet him a couple of times. But talk about how you pick people to mentor you and find your shortcomings and improve them.
Yeah. It's a really good question. First of all, I think I have always taken on leadership positions. I'll tell you something funny I learned about myself just a number of years ago. My father passed away first, and then my mother in her mid-80s passed away back in 2008. And as we were going through, she had different files. I didn't know that she saved every report card on me from grammar school and kindergarten.
Sounds like my father.
I know. And I'm not going to show them to you. But my kindergarten teacher commented, I had no clue about this. Her words, I'm paraphrasing, were something about Corey has an amazing worldview and is a natural leader, and the other students gather around him. I mean, it almost brought me to tears. And my wife looked at that and said, see, it's genetic with you. You were like that in kindergarten. So clearly there was something just about my personality. We can debate what's nature and nurture and the way you're raised, but I've always recognized it in myself. And I can tell you funny stories through high school and college and whatnot. So there's something about me that I like building teams. I like inspiring people. That's just part of my own DNA, my own personality. But then how do you learn? And you learn by watching people. You make mistakes, but you learn by watching. And so you try to surround yourself by really good people. I've mentioned some of them already today. And the danger of me going through a list of all the people I think have had mentorship roles is that I'm going to leave somebody out, and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But I can go from Don Kennedy to Stelios. I put Ed Penhode in there. John Walker was in there. The list just keeps going on and on of people from every chapter of my life that I would keep learning from. And you're always the student. I told you I'm turning 73 in a week. I continue to learn new things. And I continue to turn to people to get advice and to learn. And sometimes the people who are teaching me are much younger than me, are far my junior, and yet they've got wisdom on something far beyond mine. So never think you know it all, and just find good people to associate yourself with. Mentors make a difference. Board of directors make a difference. Just be open to that.
Thank you. Thank you for that plug-in. Let's move on to VenBio. So you must have dealt with a bunch of venture capitalists in your startup world and everything else you did. How did that experience shape forming VenBio?
When I came out of Pfizer, I was getting offers to come, as often happens, when people leave pharma companies, venture firms, especially if they built companies before, you're attractive. People want you to come be a venture partner or a partner, something, want you to come help them. And this was 2009. Remember, there was the Lehman Brothers meltdown in October of 2008, and we had that recession, and the biotech world had collapsed, the venture world. I was looking at these venture firms and looking at all these broken portfolios, and I didn't want to just babysit and help take care of other people's mistakes. And I always like it. I shouldn't tell you this because it'll just inspire somebody to do this. I've found, and friends of mine have found all throughout my life, the best way to get Corey to do something is to say, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that. It works with me. I love risk. I love challenge. And I remember people saying, because I started asking, what would it be like to form a new venture firm? Oh, you can't do that. It's really hard to do, impossible, etc. Can't do. And so I hooked up with a couple of other guys and we did it. I have to tell you, looking back, it was crazy. It was hard work, flying all over the place. VenBio's investors now are family offices from all over the world, university endowments, funds of funds. I mean, it's many of the typical investors of venture firms. Those people weren't going to invest in VenBio's first fund. And so where did we get our money? Our money came from the strategic world, the pharma world. It came from the world I'd just come from. People who trusted me and some of my other partners in those days. So we got our money for our first fund, for $180 million, from Amgen, from Baxter, and from PPD, which was a clinical trial CRO, and a bit from Alexandria. So these were all from corporations who knew us, trusted us, thought we could help in an interesting way with the companies we would start. Fortunately, we did so well and built such a reputation that by Fund 2, they became maybe half the fund. By Fund 3, a small part, and by Fund 4 and Fund 5, no part at all. And don't get me wrong, I love the strategics and I love my contacts with the pharma world, but it's actually much easier to have a venture fund in the long run that has smaller investors that are wealthy families, as I say, university endowments. That's more stable in a sense long term. But we could not have gotten VenBio started if it wasn't for those strategics. So to my friends at Amgen, Baxter, what became Baxalta, PPD, and also Merck that came in shortly after, I just say, as I tell them in private, thank you, thank you. We wouldn't have gotten started without you. And that was what got VenBio going. And now we're on stable footing. And it's fun. The part about having a venture firm, there are lots of things I like, which I'll tell you. The part I dislike is having to raise money. But let's face it, in this world, we all have to raise money. So to the extent that we are successful and we give back, that we return capital back to those investors so that they're playing on house money, we give them back their money quickly. and that we give them good returns on investment consistently fund to fund, then they come back and they reinvest. And so it makes our funds oversubscribed. We're very open and honest with our LPs, they really like us for our honesty and openness. I mean, we have a very good relationship with our investors. And to me, that's good hygiene. And I'm quite open with them. I tell them, I do this because I like turning science into medicine. I am really happy about all those drugs that are approved and the patients that are getting cured and helped. And if our strategy along the way also means that you guys are happy financially and you'll keep investing, that's a win-win world. Then we can keep doing what we like doing, and we've gotten good at it. I have a very small team. Right now, going forward into our next fund, there's really just 5 of us on the investment side. I mean, if you look at VenBio's website,
I saw 6 on the investment team and 3 on the operational part.
It doesn't look like other venture firms. You don't see 30, 40, 50 names. You don't see offices all over the world. We are one office, one small group. But what everybody has is, first of all, really smart. The young people smarter than me. MDs, PhDs, MD, PhDs, they've all built companies. All of them worked in other investment firms. Yvonne came from Flagship, Aaron came from Vivo, Rich came from Third Rock, and they all are great people, fun to work with, roll up their sleeves, do their own diligence. We work as a team. We make decisions as a team. We have fun. And so I'm just thrilled to keep going on because, in a sense, we and I from the beginning have built a venture firm in just the way I wanted to see one work. It's not top heavy. You may say, well, Corey, you're the oldest and more senior, but we are very horizontal in how we work. We are very equal in how we work. And that means that everybody's voice is equally important. Everybody is heard. People will tell you who are in my lab back in my academic days. When we stood around with ideas, everybody's voice mattered. And they were welcome to say, Corey, I think that idea is bad. I don't like that experiment you're thinking of. Here's what we should do. And I'd say, great, let's think about that. I mean, put ideas on the table, let them be shot down. And to me, that's the same principle for a venture firm. It's not hierarchical. It's really everybody at the table in this small team. And by one office, we can be a small team.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. So maybe you can shed some light on the investment thesis that you used to raise money from LPs, and also thesis that you used to pick startups. Based on that.
Our investment thesis. We will invest in things at any stage. We do seed investments, Series A, Series B, any stage. We're mostly therapeutic, but any kind of therapeutic approach. So if you say, well, are you guys seed or are you phase 1 or what? Yes, we're everything. But we look at investment opportunities and ask ourselves, can this really reach a valuation inflection point with a chance for an exit in less than 5 years, in 3 to 5 years? And that really focuses and gives you a discipline. And why we try to look in that time frame, not everything works out that way. But it's nice to think at the beginning, is there potentially a real drug? And can we get phase 1B or phase 2 data in less than 5 years? And that focuses you on saying, how do I execute and how do I do that? So if we come in at a seed stage, which we do in many cases, and co-found things, we think it's in an area where we can really get to some meaningful valuation creation in a period of 5 years. And it means let's focus. Or if we come in later, and that's part of our success and the ease for raising money, because investors love to see that you get their capital returned. Our LPs will say, Corey, what bugs us is some other venture firms, they tell me the names, I won't tell you. They say, people are telling us this fund may be a 4X, maybe a this. And we say to them, well, fine, but it's already 3 or 4 years old. Could you give me more than 15% of my invested capital back? Give me my money back, and then let's play on house money. That's when they want to reinvest in your next fund. And our first 3 funds are all playing on house money for them now, and they love that. It's called DPI. So the principle is we want to make real drugs. You don't see us get involved in really hypey things with huge valuation, huge amount of money that make all the different little biotech news things that get sent out. You won't see us involved in those kinds of deals that I think are just based on momentum and hype. But you will see us involved in things that go along in a very rational way, where we help the entrepreneurs, help the team, and that lead to real drugs. We won't invest if we think something is just hype or smoke and mirrors. It has to be something where you convince us this really has a shot to work in a human being and make a difference, because that's why I do what I do. And that's why Rich and Aaron and Yvonne do what they do. And Jama, who helps us, and Rob, who helped me build the firm and is still involved. We all do this because we want to make a difference in human health. So you come to me as an entrepreneur, and how long is it really going to take? What's the risks? What's the chance it's really going to make a difference? Those are our principles for investment. By the way, we do look for human validation. If you show me there's something in human genetics, remember, I was a Drosophila geneticist. I love genetics. Human genetics, everyone knows that's Corey's soft spot. You can also get me excited with human tissue, human cells, primate data. Are you able to do an experiment? If you say, no, I haven't been able to afford the primate data, but here's what we could learn in a primate, then I'm going to say, let's make that first tranche or first seed money small. Let's put a small amount of money to work, and can we de-risk it? One of the things you learn in the venture world, I'll tell you an interesting number. I only know these numbers because you get them together when you raise money. And this might surprise you. You say, how many winners do we have and how many losers? Remember, what I want to do is make drugs, but this is what the LPs care about. I'll tell you, 55% winners, 45% losers, more or less.
Wow. That's
about 50 to 50, right? 55, 45. So that's interesting. That says when we make an investment, we're good enough that we pick things that 50% of the time they work and 50% of the time they fail. So how does that make your investors money? Because the 50% of the winners make about tenfold more than the losers lose. One of the things you learn over time, from the winner perspective, if I can use the baseball analogy, it's made up of lots of singles and doubles and triples and an occasional home run. You have a nice waterfall. The losers, the things that don't work, let's just be blunt and call them losers. You're trying to learn how to mitigate that, how to make it as small as possible, how to make the first investment or the first tranche, even if someone is raising 60, 80 million, how to say, what's the risk here? And what's the place where if this doesn't work, we're going to cut? And you want to say honestly to the entrepreneurs, if this doesn't work at this point, we're not going to put in more money. And how to be disciplined about that so that the losers are smaller amounts. I think what we've gotten better at over the years, our first fund, we had more bigger losers. We have a slide on this of our set of losers. We update this every year for our LPs. And we have fewer big losers, and our losers are smaller. We've just gotten more disciplined at how to do the tranching and how to think about risk and milestones. And we try to impart that on the entrepreneurs to say that's the way they have to think too. They have to think about what's the risk reward and how to do the best by your investors. And the best means not just if it wins, but if it loses, how to have gotten to that loss as fast and efficiently as possible. Because if your first company blows up, it doesn't mean we're not going to come and others aren't going to come support you for your second loss. It's always good to say in my first loss, I only lost 10 million. I didn't go lose 150 million. So that's one of the things you learn in time. So just contemplate that 55-45, but the winners make tenfold more, times, losers lose. Yeah. That's how you have a successful venture fund.
Absolutely. I think that kind of focus, honesty, and discipline, I think that is appreciated by the entrepreneurs too, I think.
And then I was talking at the Baker Labs on another panel I was on recently where I gave that number and I said to them, so think if you're coming and pitching me, can you sit down with me and can we talk? Can you actually look me in the eye and say, I think there's a certain point where this will have a 50% chance of working in humans. If you don't mind a Yiddish phrase, that's chutzpah. But can you convince me? Can you say, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, if you think there's really a good chance that this is going to work, what gives you that good chance it's going to work in a human being? Human genetics, human cells, primate data. What is it that makes you think it's not just a good mouse experiment, but this actually can work in a human being if you pick the right patients? Excellent. That's a powerful way to go back to the entrepreneur.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Corey, you've been very, very patient with me on a Friday evening. I would be respectful of your time. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we close this? Any closing comments or actionable advice that founders can follow or should follow?
No, I would just say to people, you are living and coming of age in an amazing period. what you can do today in thinking about a company and technology and how to try to solve human disease is so much more sophisticated and fun. I wish in 93 and 94, when Jerry and Spiros and I were starting Exelixis, I wish we had half the tools and half the databases and knowledge you do today. It's just a fun period. Enjoy it. You have a chance to make an impact on human disease, on society. And that's what you should want to do with your life, is make an impact. And I'll tell you, if you make an impact, all the other things with success and financial success will all come with it. Don't focus on financial success. Focus on making an impact on society. And with it, society will treat you well.
Corey, this has been fun and tremendously helpful for me, and I'm sure for the others that will be listening. I hope we'll have another opportunity to continue this conversation because I have so much in my mind to learn from you, and I hope we can do this again. But thank you so much for everything.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.